A few days ago, a friend, an associate, call him what you will, from the Northwest, a region I like a lot in England, called me and said, Harry, you haven't been saying much recently. You've been mum on your YouTube channel. Nothing about COVID, nothing about the MENA and Gulf region, nothing about Armenian issues. And of course, he was right. And there are many reasons why that has happened, not least being busy, not least being in a state of apathy when I look at the political realities surrounding us all. But I thought, okay, let me today, this weekend, it's a sunny day, it's a nice day. Let me just throw 3 or 4 or 5 thoughts your way. Just food for thought. I keep on saying this mantra like, I'm not here analyzing. This YouTube channel is not an analysis channel. That is the flagship Middle East analysis, which I do with James Abbott once a month. This one is more like throwing ideas out and up to you to decide whether it makes sense to you or not. So let's, without further ado, let's get on with it. The first one that I would like to draw your attention to today is Russia-Ukraine. Now, of course, it's again in the news. Well, it's been in the news for 8 months now, and it's certainly in the news today because of the explosion on the Kerch Road and Rail Bridge, which is basically the sole link between Crimea and Russia. That explosion would set oil tankers ablaze and cause the collapse of 2 car lanes. Now, since that explosion took place, there have been accusations traded right, left, and center. Analysts and observers galore have been trying to explain what happened and the significance of what happened. Because what matters is the significance and the reactions of both parties, Ukrainians and Russians, let alone of their backers and of the international community to this latest development in this war. But I would basically look at it slightly differently and would suggest to you that this is one incident, a nasty incident, a setback perhaps, a demonstration of the frailty of the Russian attempts in this war, the foolhardy attempts to enter into a war, a special military operation, which never should have taken place. You and I agree on that, not only because it's against international law, but also because it's been proven that Russia was not prepared for this war, did not have the necessary wherewithal to wage this war. And the Ukrainians have ferociously fought back to defend their own country. All that being as it may, I think the question now for me is far more critical and far more substantial. It's not about an explosion here and an explosion there. It's not about this incident or that. It's what happens next. What after 8 months? And of course, at the moment, everybody is talking about the fact that Russia's President Vladimir Putin might use nuclear tactical attacks on Kiev, on the Ukraine, in order to, or on the lines, supply lines into Ukraine, in order to prove a point. Well, that is a very dangerous issue. But the key issue for me is, okay, all that are symptoms. What about the outcome? What about the egress? What about the way out of this conflict? For instance, with all this talk about nuclear attacks and nuclear involvement, President Biden warning President Putin hinting that he might use tactical nuclear weapons, President Zelensky saying, no, that's not going to happen. Pressure is also mounting, particularly in the United States, particularly on the Hill, to designate Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. Now, that is a critical move. I think personally that President Biden wouldn't want to go there, but we can see that both houses are quite keen on it. The speaker is quite keen on it. It's a move that would apply new sanctions to Moscow and put it on a short list of countries that the US treats as pariahs. Now, that is serious, and that is not, in my opinion, the way forward. The way forward is very simple. It's not even to talk about the nuclear weapons, the tactical nuclear weapons. It's not about this bridge and that town that's been taken and occupied and then deoccupied. It's about how do we come to an end? And in order to come to an end, we should focus on finding a way that actually preserves the integrity of Ukraine and at the same time gives Russia's Putin an honorable exit out of this war. That is where minds should be laboring at. What is the formula? Again, I go back to alternative dispute resolution, to conflict resolution. If we assume that we have reached a few peaks already, what is the way whereby we can actually contain this war before it blazes out of control, and try to find a way that not necessarily would go to the status quo ante, but that would actually spare Ukrainians and the region and the world, because the world is suffering, whether it's from the energy prices, whether it's from the supply lines, whatever you want to call it. We need to find a way. If more people would exercise more of their gray cells on finding solutions, scenarios, conflict resolution scenarios that would get us out of this pit, rather than constantly ramping up the situation from one side and then response from the other side, we might actually prove to be cleverer than we have been so far. That's all I'm going to say on Russia-Ukraine. A lot of people would be unhappy with what I've just said. I've heard words such as defeatist, appeasement, etc., but I don't care. This is what I think, and this is what I suggest to you as food for thought. The second thing I want to go is Iran. Now, when I talk about Iran, I talk about the protests, of course, that started with the murder of Mahsa Amini. Now, Mahsa Amini was a young woman. She was killed. The regime tried to dress it up as something else. Of course, they failed, and the world knew it was not something else. And in all the provinces, there have been protests. Now, the question is, are those protests the same as the ones that took place many times over the past? 2009 is only one example, one iconic example, but only an example. I don't think so. I don't think so for two reasons. One, because I believe that the present protests, where you see young women throwing away or burning their face coverings or hijabs, when you see schoolgirls in schools defying the spiritual leader and the Iranian authorities, when you see men actually clapping and supporting women in their protests, which is key, which is significant, because this is not only a protest of women pitted against men. When all this is happening, what I would suggest for you as food for thought are 2 points. One, the protests today in Iran transcend social sectarian boundaries. Why? Because they're bringing together, for the first time, I believe, since the Iranian Revolution of 1979, bringing together a much broader stratum of Iranian society than we have seen in years. This is solidarity which is going across the country. And if this were the case, and if this is not just one pocket of the population, but that it is spreading across the different boundaries, then I would also say that for the first time since 1979, and for the first time since the punitive measures taken by the authorities against any dissent, I think that whatever the government gives now, it won't be enough to assuage the grievances of the protesters. I would be surprised, but it would be at a very high cost if the protests were basically stopped, managed, killed off being the appropriate term, because of the fervor across the whole country. It's not only in parts of Iran, it's across the whole country, north, south, east, and west. I think that it would be very difficult without some radical change for these protests to stop. Something has given. As one analyst said, the train has already left the station. So where would we go? The days and weeks ahead will show. Now, how does these protests, impact the JCPOA non-nuclear agreement? Well, of course it's damaged because the optics of entering into an agreement with a country that is basically randomly killing and subjugating its population was, and hope still is, anathema to a Western political culture. But I still believe that we shouldn't intertwine, we shouldn't bond these two together too tightly, because the JCPOA is a political agreement. And it's got its adversaries and it's got its supporters. The protests are human protests. And I don't think the two are on the same sound wave. Now, the JCPOA might be damaged, it might never happen, or at the last minute surprise it might. But I don't think that it's entirely relevant to the protests happening on the streets of Iran. And if anything, Iran might actually try to counter this wave by showing a bit more flexibility on the JCPOA in order to temper the situation domestically or internally. Let us see what happens. Again, food for thought. Then I go to Yemen. Why do I go to Yemen? I go to Yemen because there has been a truce. It started in April of this year, a 2-month truce, extended twice. And now the United Nations Secretary General and the UN envoy in Yemen, Hans Grundberg, wanted to extend it for 6 months. Now, in the meantime, during this short period of truce, remember, the war has been going on for years and years. And what has happened? Tens of thousands killed. An economy, such as there was, devastated, and millions left hungry. All that be as it may, the agreement, the truce that held for a few months, allowed some ships fuel into Hodeidah in the Houthi-controlled north of Yemen, as well as Sana'a airport operated a few flights to Jordan, to Egypt, etc. But the Houthis now have upped the ante. They want more this and that. They want money to pay their own functionaries. They want that money to come into a dollar account that they control. Of course, the Saudis wouldn't be too happy with that. So I hope again with Yemen that the United Nations, as that much maligned mechanism that tries to tamp down conflicts, that it would be able, through its envoy, through its Secretary General, be able to renew and extend this truce. Because at the end of the day, I've said this time again, if we consider this Yemeni war a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, it's not the Iranians and the Saudis that are suffering. Yes, a few missiles a few drones trespass into Saudi airspace and cause damage. Iran might be affected, but the real people who are affected are the Yemenis. And I have a keen fondness for Yemenis, and I like the country. So I really, really hope that people will get a little bit more responsible and actually spare the population of Yemen further deaths, further devastation, further hunger by actually doing this extension and stopping to play politics, as has been the case since time immemorial in the world, to stop playing politics and to help the Yemeni population. Then a question mark, and only a question mark, because there is a wonderful analyst in Lebanon, her name is Laura Haytayan, who actually focuses on this, is the delimitation of the territorial waters of Israel and Lebanon in relation to the oil exploration facilities in those maritime waters. We thought a few days ago that a deal had been almost reached when the whole thing fell apart again. Of course, the impact is quite clear, because on the one hand, if there is no deal and tensions mount, then tensions also mount for a conflict, a war between Hezbollah in South Lebanon, which would drag the whole Lebanon into the war as well, willy-nilly, and Israel. And at the same time, remember, Israel is having elections on the 1st of November. And Yair Lapid, the caretaker prime minister, is desperately trying to prove that he's a better choice for the electorate than Benjamin Netanyahu, who seems to be pretty confident that he might actually sneak into the office of prime minister once more after the elections. So the odds are perhaps a little bit, I don't know, for or against concluding the deal, but the tensions are definitely there. And on the MENA and Gulf region, I would also like to conclude with one very key issue that has concerned me immensely. And that is the meeting that took place between our new Prime Minister Liz Truss and the caretaker Prime Minister Yair Lapid of Israel, where the latter asked the former to move the UK embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, just like ex-President Trump did with their own embassy. And it seems to me that Liz Truss, the Prime Minister, was very amenable. She said that James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, will look at it, and there are murmurs in some arcane corridors that this might actually happen. And I really pray and hope that it will not. Not because there's going to be an Armageddon the next day, not because the world is going to collapse, but because it is going to complicate even further any entente, any deal, any coexistence between Palestinians and Israelis if the United Kingdom, a country that carries a whole history, a whole baggage of responsibility for what has been happening in that part of the world, in Palestine, since before the Balfour Project. And I would suggest that the United Kingdom, congruent with what the 27 EU countries and the majority of the World Committee is doing, keep its embassy in the United Kingdom, in the United Kingdom, keep its embassy in Tel Aviv. And I would suggest also, since this is only food for thought, I keep saying all the time boringly, if you want to look what's happening there, if you want to see what's been written about it, there are many sources. There's so many sources. Al Monitor is one source. There are others as well. There is a lot on the websites of Al Jazeera and Al Arabi. But another one is a charity called Balfour Project. You can find it. I'll leave a note on the description in the description box, who write a lot about this and who have circulated a letter about this. And Balfour Project and its former president, Sir John Fean, are really doing a good job in trying to diffuse further tensions by tackling whatever British responsibility there is for what happens today in Israel-Palestine. The Israel-Palestine situation had two components. One was Israel, one was Palestine. The Israel-Palestine component of putting these two together, Israel's deal was secured. The Palestine deal is still pending. So think about it. And I really hope that the British government will be sensible and intelligent enough not to go there, and that all this talk about considering it, etc., are just nothing more than political niceties. And finally, I would also want to say a word or two about COVID. There's been a surge of some 40% in cases of COVID in this country. Let's take the nation, England. Hospital admissions have increased. Lately, I was in hospital for something else, and I was told by some medical friends there that the admission rates are increasing across all foundations and trusts, and that we are heading for a double pandemic, COVID and flu in winter. So I really hope that we wake up, that we start becoming a little bit more responsible, and that the government, whilst not closing down, that is beyond the pale, the government would sensitize the people to what is happening and ask them to exercise caution, because otherwise we are heading for trouble come winter. I stop on this. I've said a fair bit. Sorry if it's a little bit discombobulated, but that's because it's unscripted. That's because I just throw ideas and thoughts at you. Part of it is because I'm lazy. I could write it down and make it more professional. But no, this is a podcast. And James has taught me in the past that a podcast should be conversational, a YouTube should be conversational. So I'm trying to do that. I hope you find something that you could pick out from the points I made here. And I also wish you a wonderful weekend, and may saner minds prevail everywhere.